Bayern Munich, they're the most successful team in German football, winning the Bundesliga 34 times, the DFB Pokal 20 times, and the Champions League 6 times. But how did they become the Bayern we all know and love to hate today? So here is the entire Bundesliga history of Bayern Munich. You're probably thinking, why are we not covering the whole history of Bayern Munich? Because I'm lazy. But here's like a brief, quick rundown. They were found in 1900 in a bar in Munich. Most football teams are founded because they weren't allowed to play football with the Munich Gymnasium, which is a complicated way of saying that's how German sports were done in the early 20th century. They won a couple of titles and then they had to change a badge during the war, which I would address because it's seen as like a gotcha moment on social media. To put it simply, Bayern were forced to change it by the Nazi government at the time. They were an inherently Jewish club. The poster boys of this Nazi era were actually Schalke. The club president of Bayern at the time, Kurt Landauer, was Jewish and he was exiled to Switzerland during the war period, but would return following the end of the war and Nazi rule to reclaim his place as president. So for people that like to use the Bayern Munich badge and be like, ha ha ha, they were Nazis, they weren't. They were forced to comply with the government at the time. After that, they would win a couple more league titles, but they would not be included in the first season of the Bundesliga due to a complicated selection process, which was like 5 teams from the Oberliga South, which was Bayern's league at the time, were admitted into the Bundesliga, with teams ranked on their accumulated records of the past 12 years. Bayern were ranked 6th. And then on top of this, city rivals 1860 Munich were the Oberliga Süd champions of that season. So they would be promoted in Bayern's favour as well, because the organisers did not want 2 teams from the same city in the league. Bayern would then compete in the second division, which was split into regional leagues at the time, with a young trio of Franz Beckenbauer, who was a defender, Gerd Müller, who was a striker, and then a goalkeeper in Sepp Maier. And the 3 would go on to be era-defining for Bayern and basically started to lay the foundations of the club they are today. But things could have been very different for this trio and 1860 Munich. So Beckenbauer, he's from a suburb in Munich called Giesing. In Giesing is the home of 1860 Munich and the Grunwalder Stadion. And so he had always dreamed of joining 1860, whereas his brother had played for Bayern. And he was set to join 1860 at the end of this, after the end of the season with his youth side, SC Munich in 1906, who had basically started to fold. And so they were playing in this local Munich youth tournament to decide like the youth champion. In the semi-finals, Beckenbauer's team ended up playing 1860 Munich. During this game, which Beckenbauer lost, an unknown 1860 player would slap him, and Beckenbauer would go back and prove to make quite a petty decision and decide, I'm not going to join that team anymore, and I'll instead join Bayern Munich. Sadly, everyone that was involved in this scenario are all dead, so no one actually knows who slapped Beckenbauer. Maier's story saw him play for an Upper Bavaria 11 against a Salzburg 11. He wasn't included in the first half of this game and was on the bench, and he was subbed on in the second half. And despite being a forward, he would end up being played in goal. And he ended up being pretty good at it. And then he got invited to play for Bayern because there was a couple of Bayern players on that Upper Bavaria 11 team. Then finally, Gerd Müller ended up at Bayern as 2 representatives of the club, got there before representatives from 1860 Munich, and was able to convince the young striker to join them instead. Now, rumours of how this happened vary. Some say that Müller thought he was speaking to 1860 representatives and thought he was joining them, while Bayern say the representatives from their rivals misread the train timetable and got there late. But this did involve the representatives from Bayern having to sneak out the back door of Gerd Müller's family home. In their only season in the second division, Bayern would gain promotion to the Bundesliga at the first time I was asking, as they were in one promotion group, and the team that went up with them in the other promotion group was a team who had adopted a similar policy for them for using local youth players, and that was Borussia Mönchengladbach. And these two would be intertwined with one another for the next decade. Bayern were immediate hit when they got promoted. They won the DFB Pokal straight away and would win the trophy again a year later. However, in 1968, the club then decided to part ways with their head coach and replace him with Branko Zebic. The Yugoslavian adopted a more conservative style of play, but it got the job done and led Bayern to the first ever Bundesliga title in 1969, with Gerd Müller finishing top scorer with 30 goals, while they also won the DFB Pokal. And this began to see the differences between Gladbach and Bayern. Bayern was seen as the more conservative team, whereas Gladbach was seen as a team that everyone would love because they play this fun, attacking, free-flowing football, and would lose games 6-4, whatever. After this, Zebic would leave in 1970, and that same season Gladbach would win their first Bundesliga title, and that cemented themselves as Bayern's challenger for the next decade. And Zebic would be replaced by a man who was meant to be, because at the time Germany would use this format where they would promote the assistant coach to the head coach of the national team, and Udo Lattek was meant to be one of them. But he decided to join Bayern instead and would be one of the most defining managers for Bayern Munich in their history. So Lattek's first role was convincing Paul Breitner and Uli Hoeneß to join the club, and both would be equally important in their own right going forward. In their first season together, this would be the first clash of their Bayern versus Gladbach, and Gladbach will win the title and their second title after final day showdown, which saw Bayern lose against Duisburg while Gladbach won. And they would go back and forth from here on out, with Bayern winning, Gladbach finishing second a couple of times, but Gladbach winning, Bayern finishing second a couple of times for basically the remainder of the decade. But a year later, after Gladbach had won their second title, Bayern would win the league once again, with Müller scoring 40 goals in a season, a record that would stand for 49 years until another Bayern striker would break it. This would start a run for Bayern, which would see them go on to win 3 titles in a row. But it was in Europe where they were finally beginning to make their mark. In 1974, they would win their 3rd league title in a row and start their streak of European Cup wins, as they beat Atletico Madrid in a final replay. Then Bayern would win the European Cup again a year later in 1975 against Leeds. The game was a rough affair, and as was expected against this edition of Leeds at the time, it was quite violent, both on and off the pitch, and it resulted in Uli Hoeneß being tackled and injuring his knee, which would have a lasting effect and force him to retire early. And then in 1976, Bayern would then beat Saint-Étienne. This game is infamous to Saint-Étienne because at Hampden Park at the time they used square goalposts. Each time Saint-Étienne hit the woodwork, it would, because of the square nature of the goalposts, they would bounce in an awkward direction. And the French say that if the post had been round, the ball would have went in at least once, and they would end up losing the match 1-0. And this is kind of like the beginning of the idea of Bayern Jusel, which is luck for Bayern when it's undeserved. But that season saw the emergence of a forward who would play an equally important role as Hoeneß did off the pitch, especially in Karl-Heinz Rummenigge. But the 1976 European Cup win would be the beginning of the end of this era of Bayern. In 1977, Beckenbauer would move to New York Cosmos, and a year later, Müller would join him in the US, moving to Fort Lauderdale, while Sepp Maier and Hoeneß both retired. And during the same period, the era of Gladbach also came to an end under former Bayern head coach Lattek, who moved to Gladbach and replaced their legendary head coach Hennes Weisweiler. Heading into the 80s, Bayern's new challenger would be a team from the north of Germany and the port city of Hamburg. Under their new head coach, Paul SONY, Bayern would crown a new era known as the Breitner era, with Rummenigge and Paul Breitner forming the duo for this next edition of this Bayern team. Bayern would go on to win back-to-back Bundesliga titles, with the striker finishing top scorer in both seasons. However, Hamburg, who were the emerging team at the time, first with a permed Englishman in Kevin Keegan, and then in the early stages of the 80s with a familiar face for Bayern known as Franz Beckenbauer, and Hamburg would match their back-to-back Bundesliga titles. Another person who was interlinked with Bayern was Günter Netzer, who was the team manager of this Hamburg side at the time and able to convince Beckenbauer to come back to Germany. A lull in success then followed for Bayern, and as did the return of Uta Lattek, who after this brief period of no success followed a period of 5 titles in 6 years, with Werder Bremen, their new challengers at the time, only being able to stop Bayern going 6 from 6. However, this success came at a cost, as Bayern was struggling financially. They had to sell their star player Karl-Heinz Rummenigge. The striker would be sold to Inter for 10 million Deutsche Marks, which at the time made him the most expensive player in the world. And this deal would set Bayern up financially for the future. And they would then immediately go about spending this money. And one was on a midfielder whose father worked at the Puma factory in Herzogenaurach, and that was Lothar Matthäus. And he would be a key figure in the upcoming years for Bayern, for good and bad. Matthäus' last game for Gladbach was in the DFB Pokal final against Bayern, which Gladbach lost, and Matthäus sat on the pitch and cried, and he was also called Judas by the Gladbach fans. Continuing this intertwinement between Gladbach and Bayern, in the latter stages of the 80s, Lattek would leave once again and would be replaced by Jupp Heynckes for his first spell at the club. The former Gladbach striker kind of led Bayern into the 90s, and with that brought new struggles and a new era for Bayern. This era became infamous. It's FC Hollywood. In the early stages of the 90s, Bayern struggled a lot on the pitch. They only won the Bundesliga once, and that was under Franz Beckenbauer, who was drafted in to save the season. And he did actually done that earlier in the decade as well, winning the Europa League. But after this title triumph with Bayern, or in the middle of the 90s, Bayern decided they wanted to build the best team possible of German players. So Bayern brought Lothar Matthäus back from Italy, who had been with Inter Milan. Oliver Kahn was signed from Karlsruhe. Then you had the likes of Mehmet Scholl, also moving from Karlsruhe, Markus Babbel, Thomas Helmer, Mario Basler would join from Werder Bremen, who had actually been part of the Bremen team to go toe-to-toe with Bayern. But the crowning signing was Jürgen Klinsmann, who they brought back to Germany, who had a success as well in England. The team managed to win the Europa League, or the UEFA Cup, and that Bundesliga title. But apart from that, it was a recipe for disaster. And so here are some of the events, not in order, that happened during this FC Hollywood era. Jürgen Klinsmann and Lothar Matthäus famously did not get along, two egos clashing, and it resulted in the latter thinking there was a conspiracy against him at Euro 96, because it was said that Klinsmann and a bunch of other Germany players had met with head coach at the time Berti Vogts to tell him that they shouldn't call up Matthäus. But it was the fact that Matthäus was a bit crap and injured as well that he wasn't called up, and obviously Germany went on to win at Euro 96. Giovanni Trapattoni was hired at the early stages of the 90s, sacked, hired again, and produced his famous rant after training about Thomas Strunz, and then won the Bundesliga before leaving again. During the period that Trapattoni wasn't at the club, Otto Rehhagel, who had made the name for himself at Werder Bremen, would be hired to try and lead this FC Hollywood era because he somehow managed to make Mario Basler and keep him under check. He was sacked and then replaced by Beckenbauer, who then led them to success. But he was able to find a new job and lead the team not to the Bundesliga. And then he was able to, after leading the team to the Bundesliga, was able to lead them to the Bundesliga title before Bayern could win another Bundesliga title. And then Stefan Effenberg, who joined later in the decade, would have an affair with Thomas Strunz's wife before then marrying her. And this is just a couple of the things that went on. Not the constant tabloid talking of what the Bayern players did on their Saturday nights at a club in Munich, the constant tabloid relationship rumours, it goes on and on and on. And it was just chaotic for Bayern. And then they made their mark, and the chaos would then end when Bayern appointed Ottmar Hitzfeld as head coach. Hitzfeld was a bit more stern with these egos and stuff, and it worked. And because he had won the Bundesliga with Dortmund and then led them to their only Champions League title. And at the time, this was a Dortmund side who were making themselves quite credible challenges for Bayern. and had basically spent themselves into nearly oblivion trying to match with Bayern, and Hitzfeld kind of kick-started this. And then when he headed south, his impact would be immediate. That year Bayern won the league, and that was the start of a 3-year winning streak. And they would make the Champions League final in 1999, where they would play Manchester United and Barcelona. The final would be Bayern's lowest moment yet, as they went into stoppage time leading 1-0 thanks to a goal from Mario Basler in the first half. And in the ZDF documentary about FC Hollywood, Basler has admitted that due to nerves, he was up drinking the night beforehand in the hotel bar, and Uli Hoeneß came down and told him, you should go to bed. And he didn't. Before goals from Teddy Sheringham and Ole Gunnar Solskjaer in stoppage time meant Bayern lost the game. And there's a story from tennis player and Bayern Munich fan Boris Becker. Goes, he and Franz Beckenbauer were in the executive boxes at the Camp Nou, and they were on the way down to the pitch. And when they were left, it was 1-0 to Bayern. And then they were in an elevator heading down the pitch, and they heard cheering, thinking the game was over. Bayern had won the Champions League. Only to get to pitch side and see they were 2-1 down. And all Becker could do was go, oh. Bayern would rebound the year later and win a domestic double the next season to enter the 2000s. In 2001, they would be on the right side of drama when they would win the Bundesliga in the dying seconds against Hamburg with an indirect free kick, ending Schalke, who was their challenger at the time, 6 minutes where they thought they'd won the league, which is known as the 6 Minuten Meister. Later, they would get their redemption in the Champions League as they beat Valencia to win their 4th Champions League title. Hitzfeld would leave in 2004, having won the Bundesliga again in 2003, and he would be replaced by Felix Magath, who would win 2 consecutive doubles and would be replaced by Hitzfeld, who won another double with the club. But the mid-2000s is most known for Bayern because they finally left the Olympic Stadium in Munich and moved to the Allianz Arena. It was their brand new state-of-the-art stadium, has a capacity of 75,000, and it was then the first major sporting event it could host was the World Cup in 2006. But it would also host the Champions League final, with the first one being in 2012, but we'll get to that later. After Hitzfeld left, Jürgen Klinsmann would come in after a successful spell with the Germany head coach, but he would be fired within a year and would be replaced by Louis van Gaal. Now, Van Gaal didn't have as much quantifiable success. He only won the league, he only won the domestic double in his time in charge, and also lost the Champions League final to Inter in 2010. But it was his other impact on the players who would go on to define this new generation for Bayern. He integrated the likes of Bastian Schweinsteiger, who was previously misprofiled as a player. Van Gaal saw him in a midfielder, and played him there. It was Thomas Müller, a player with little physical qualities that could have been of use, but with the campaigning from Hermann Gerland, Müller was integrated, and they joined fellow graduate Philipp Lahm in the team, who was more of a regular and had previously spent time on loan at Stuttgart. While in this early stages, Frank Ribery joined in 2007, and then Arjen Robben would move from Real Madrid and join Bayern. And Van Gaal would leave in 2011, and Heinkes would return to take charge of the team. And this would be a turning point for the club. In 2012, they had reached the Champions League final, where they would face Chelsea, an unlikely Chelsea side, at the Allianz Arena, their home. The Finale de Home. In the league, Bayern had stuttered over the past 2 years. It allowed Borussia Dortmund to now take reign and win 2 titles under Jurgen Klopp. But heading into this final, Bayern were overwhelming favourites, not only because of Chelsea's unlikely path to the final, but also because it was at home. And in the 83rd minute, it looked as if they'd won it when Thomas Müller scored. However, 5 minutes later, Chelsea would equalise through Didier Drogba. Bayern had a chance, the game would go to extra time, and Bayern had a chance to win it when they had a penalty, and Arjen Robben took it, but it was saved by Petr Cech, meaning the game would then go to penalties, which Bayern would lose. And this 13 at Wembley. And they were going to break records. They finished top of the league with 91 points, which is a record, and still is today. And that would be Heinkes' legacy. He managed to lead this team from one of the worst moments in the club's history to one of the best. And he would be replaced by one of the greatest managers ever in Pep Guardiola. However, at the time, things off the pitch managed to become a bit complicated. Uli Hoeneß, who had transitioned to management after retiring, and is one of the masterminds in moulding Bayern into the team they are today, would be sent to prison for tax evasion and would not be released until 2016. 2013 proved to be the beginning of an unprecedented period of dominance for Bayern. Whether that would be managed to sign the best players such as Robert Lewandowski or Mario Götze and Mats Hummels from their rivals, or they just went on this relenting run where they would win 11 titles in a row. But at the same time, Bayern struggled in the Champions League, as in they've struggled to get it over the line and get to the final. After winning it in 2013, they didn't reach the final again until 2020. They had come close a few times reaching the semi-finals, but they never had that instinct to finish it off. And they would, through the process, sack Carlo Ancelotti and Niko Kovac, while Pep Guardiola even left. And Heinkes came out of retirement to rescue the team in 2018. But in 2020, it was a different interim who would come in and lead a new change at the club. Hansi Flick came in to replace Niko Kovac, and that completely changed the team's fortunes. And in the year 2020, they won the treble, comfortably winning the Bundesliga, the DFB Pokal, and then beating PSG 1-0 in the final in Lisbon in a COVID-ravaged campaign. And during the year of 2020, they would go on to win all 6 trophies available to them. And no team came close to truly challenging Bayern during this period, except for right at the end of it. In March 2023, Bayern were first in the league. They were still in the DFB Pokal with a favourable tie and had a Champions League game against Manchester City on the horizon. Then out of the blue, in a random international break, they decided to sack head coach Julian Nagelsmann with the opinion that the treble was at risk. Only 18 months beforehand, they had paid a record fee for Nagelsmann for a head coach, and they were replacing for Thomas Tuchel, the head coach Hansi Flick had beaten in that final in 2020. They would be immediately eliminated from both the Pokal and Champions League and would win the league by the skin of their teeth, thanks to Jamal Musiala's late winner and Borussia Dortmund's incompetence. However, a year later, that streak would come to an end when Bayer Leverkusen would win their first ever Bundesliga title. And this was the Leverkusen side who had been known as Neverkusen. And the thing that Leverkusen did, they did it unbeaten. This is something Bayern have never been able to do. And even if they do it from now on, they will never be the first to do it either. Now they sacked Tuchel, replaced him with Vincent Kompany, and he's came in and made the team more dominant, and they won the Bundesliga in his first season in charge. And at the moment, Bayern do look like the best team in the world, and they look like they could go on to win everything available to them. But I think what this story shows is not only is basically every single team in Germany not named Bayern quite poorly run, is that Bayern are so well run that they can maintain this period of dominance. The challenges they faced are Gladbach, Hamburg, Bremen, Cologne, and Dortmund, Schalke, and they've outlived them all. Bayern have been the one consistent throughout the whole over 50 years, 60 years of the Bundesliga. All these other teams have struggled at one point and have never been able to keep up because Bayern have been so well run over these years. Granted, in the past 30 years, there's been dips in how well they've been run, but their dips have not been catastrophic enough that they have flirted with relegation, flirted with going bust, got relegated or whatever. And as much as you and I love to hate on Bayern, it's the acknowledgement that they're just a very well-run club and they're very good at what they do. And granted, the people in charge now, like I'm talking Hoeneß and everyone else, they had time to give it up because they're losing touch. But during the period, they've always been in touch and on brand and knew the decisions to make. They took risks and they didn't even let these monumental moments like stop them. Like losing a Champions League final in the dying moments would have killed a team basically. But they bounced back, and within 3 years, or within 2 years, they won the title, or they won the Champions League. Losing the final at home, again, this is something that, granted that the Allianz has hosted the Champions League final twice in 2 years. It doesn't happen often. It happens it's been 12 years since. And it's like a once in a generation thing, and that generation had failed. But they still managed to rally and come back and win the title. And on Bayern's well running, you can see it in all their like finances and stuff. It's the fact they're miles ahead of everyone in the league because they've done things so smartly. It does also help they're based in Munich, which is a financial hub in Germany. So they can have the likes of Audi, Adidas and Allianz like be some sort of investor in the team. But when you have that money, you still have to make it work. And they've done that well. Granted, there's still dodgy stuff that they do, whether it be Qatar or Rwanda as sponsors, or UAE. They're a mega club, and they've been able to do it within the confines of 50+1, which should be a credit to what they've done. And so, yeah, this is the history of Bayern Munich, the Bundesliga history of Bayern Munich. Most of this information I've got was actually from Uli Hess's book on Bayern Munich. So, and I have not covered everything because there's so much to cover, and if there was, this video would be ungodly long. So if you want to find out more, I would urge you to read that instead. So yeah, let me know what you think of Bayern. Do you love them? Do you hate them? Are you indifferent about them?